Is it possible to capture adequately the history of America of over hundreds of years in a single book, even if that book is 800 pages long? Did Jill Lepore manage to do that in These Truths? Well, I have some thoughts. Let's take a look. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, just finished Jill Lepore's massive History of America, one-volume history called These Truths. And as usual, I want to comment on the main idea, the research behind it, the readability of it, and the reasonableness of the argument that's put forward. So the main idea here is pretty obvious. It's a history of America. It's a single-volume history of America. She starts from Columbus, the age of discovery, from a European perspective at least, the age of discovery, and goes straight through up until 2016. On the election of Trump. So that's the main idea, is that it's presenting a history of America. But every history, right, is an interpretation, and the way that you frame the telling of history is part of that interpretation. And so all I really want to say about the main idea here is that the title is perfect. It's about these truths. She tells the story of America as a struggle over the truths that were declared self-evident in the Declaration of Independence, right? Particularly the equality of humanity. So she tells that whole multiple hundred years history as a struggle, a wrestling match to kind of realize these truths that were declared, to be a nation founded on that. And she portrays it as a struggle, as a back and forth. Key figures show up on both sides of different aspects and manifestations of that struggle, and she tells the narrative straight through, from Columbus to Trump. So that's the main idea. The research behind it, she's a serious historian, Harvard historian, and so it's serious historical research behind it. Lots of serious historical work was done. She pulls out a lot of quotations from a lot of primary sources, but also a lot of secondary sources, so it was not unusual for me to see a quote or see an idea footnoted, and then to go back to the footnotes and see that it was referenced in a secondary source, quoted in a secondary source, that kind of thing. But I mean, she did a lot of homework on this to pull out a lot of primary quotes from a lot of interesting figures from a diversity of kind of viewpoints and chapters of American history. One other thing I want to say about the research is that the endnotes, sometimes when you read nonfiction, endnotes include commentary in the endnotes, so it's not unusual for writers to maybe not have a place for commentary in the main text, and so they put it back in the endnotes, which I actually kind of like that. I enjoy kind of going back and forth to the endnotes and seeing what commentary is shelved back there. This book, however, has almost no commentary in the endnotes. So I don't know, maybe this is like way too specific of a thing for my type of reading, but if you read it all like me and you think about books that way, just know that the endnotes here really are just literal references from where different things came, and there are a lot of them. I mean, she did, again, she's an historian, she did a lot of work citing all that stuff. So just know the endnotes are not any commentary. All of the commentary is in the text itself. All right, the readability of this. So it's long. I mentioned this at the very beginning, but it's about an 800-page, solid 800 pages of reading. So it's very long, but man, is it well written. I found it very engrossing. And just the style, I mean, it is not dry. It does not at all read like a history textbook, just reporting facts. It's written, frankly, I think she's just a good writer. I mean, I'd like to just read more of her writing in general. It's the first book I've read by her. I found the style super engrossing, and it's just super easy to read. So massive success on the readability front. If that's something, because of its length, if that's possibly like intimidating you, don't let it, because it's a really readable book. All right, and finally, the reasonableness of this. As I said, history is always an interpretation. So her agenda, there's always an agenda to telling a history. And her agenda, if you could say that, I don't think that's too strong a word to use, but her agenda is to put forward, it's hard to articulate this, but it's a positive story of America in that sense of validating the truths that America was supposedly founded on. Like, she finds those worth fighting for and holding on to. So it's positive in that sense, but it also does not gloss over the sins and the evils in the historical telling, in the ways that those truths have been not upheld or even fought against. So it's a positive reclaiming of these truths, but it's not a whitewashed or sanitized telling of how we as Americans have not realized these truths, if that makes sense. So it's positive and negative at the same time. And in that, I found it pretty fair, pretty critical where critique is deserved of America, and pretty even-handed overall. And you can tell also that this was written with an eye on the Trump era, so to speak. It ends there, and you can tell in the ways, the certain themes she brings out over the course of the history of America, that she kind of has an eye on what's happening in the Trump era. So some examples are, she brings out the emergence of political polling. When did that become an industry? I didn't know anything about that. I learned a lot in this book about when polling started to happen and the ways that started to impact the way elections happen in this country. It's actually a pretty long history from the early 1900s. That was interesting. She documents the first time the words fake news were recorded in the media, which is a pretty long time ago. That might be surprising to learn about. There's a lot about media bias, especially as media becomes more of an industry in the country. There's a fascinating theme of the battle over healthcare and trying to actually move the country towards a more universal healthcare. You might be surprised at some of the presidents and politicians who tried to do that in past decades. So these are themes that as I was reading it, I thought, oh, okay, she's thinking about the Trump era and trying to point us back to where some of these things showed up in our history. But that's not a negative. That's just an interesting way to tell our history. And I think for our time, it's really, really helpful. And so I'll end by just saying a couple more things. So she does tell the story through obviously the World Wars and the Civil War, but I love that this doesn't get too derailed or distracted into telling the story of the wars, if that makes sense. It doesn't go into battles, it doesn't go into glorifying fighting and war. It stays really focused on policies, economics, cultural shifts in America as a result of those wars, and certain cultural trends that move back and forth from presidency to presidency. It's just fascinating to see how different elections kind of responded to each other and the different things that came to the surface in the cultural conversations about things like populism versus business versus labor unions. Like that stuff, just the currents of the way those things move in and around, you can really only get a full sense of that in a book like this. There's lots of books that dive deep into specific chapters of history, but to go from Columbus to Trump in that way and to get the full kind of zoomed out view, it just affords you a different perspective on the story of America. Last thing I'll say is, I alluded to this a minute ago, I found it fairly even-handed. She is critical of both the conservative and progressive impulses in our country, I think at appropriate times. So this is not, I kept thinking of the two books as I was reading this, Howard Zinn's People's History, and then the response to it, The Patriots' History of the United States. Those were two books that were written fairly close to each other with pretty clear agendas, left, right, respectively, progressive, conservative, respectively. And this, I think, threads a needle between those really well. It's critical of conservative politicians, but also critical of progressive ones when appropriate. So, all right, it's hard to keep a video short on a book that's so long and so comprehensive as this, but I loved this book. If you couldn't tell, I loved it as a history. I learned a lot from reading it, and I just loved the experience of reading it. So if you're willing to dive into an 800-page tome, a single volume history, man, this is probably the best one to go to, particularly if you want to unpack and decode some of the cultural things that are moving around as we kind of live in this post-Trump America that we find ourselves in. So Jill Lepore's book, These Truths, fantastic, magnificent one-volume history of America. Highly, highly recommended. So hope that you enjoyed this. Hope this might help you find a book that you will fall in love with next. Thanks.